I collapsed on my kitchen floor on my birthday. One moment I was standing at the sink, turning the faucet because the kettle wouldn't hold heat for long, and the next my knees gave out, my fingers skidding on cold linoleum. I remembered the taste of metal at the back of my mouth, my heart punching like it wanted out. I tried to call Raymond, my son. My hands were clumsy, the screen blurred. Instead of the steady, practiced ring I expected, a message flew out. Wrong name, wrong number. The light blinking with a name I hadn't seen in years. Peter. I could have crawled to the phone, I thought. I could have pulled myself up, but the breath wouldn't come the way it used to. I heard someone in the hallway. Patricia, my neighbor. She'd been the one to check the door when she didn't see my light. Her voice, thin with alarm. "Barbara, are you there?" She was older than me by a couple summers, the kind of neighbor who kept a key on a ribbon and tea in the pot for emergencies. She found me on the floor and called 911. Someone took my phone. Someone pressed the wrong button. In the ambulance, noise felt distant. Sirens like a sad crowd. The paramedics' questions slipping in and out. I stopped counting time. I woke in a room that smelled like antiseptic and coffee. A nurse shook my shoulder gently. My first thought, stubborn and small, was that Raymond would be furious to find me like this on my birthday. He would say I should have called him sooner. I kept my eyes closed because the light made me dizzy. When I opened them again, there was a young man in the chair by the window, hair too dark for my memory, jeans pressed and clean as if he'd folded himself into that chair and never left. He looked like someone I should have known, and yet I had to breathe deliberately to place him. Peter, my grandson. He looked up when I blinked. When he smiled, an uncertain, careful thing, my chest cramped. He was older than the boy I remembered, taller. There were lines at the corners of his mouth that didn't belong to a teenager. He smelled faintly of the coffee he must have brewed in the hospital waiting room. He smelled like adult decisions and late nights. He didn't look like someone who would have been there if my phone had reached the person it was meant to reach. "Hi, Nana," he said. It was the first time anyone had called me that in a long while. It landed like a soft stone. "Take it slow. You're home now." "Where's Raymond?" I asked, because that was the reflex, because Raymond had always been the person people expected to show up, the son who took care of what mattered. Peter's jaw tightened. "He didn't come," Peter said. His voice wasn't accusatory, it was flat, used. "But I'm here. I came as soon as I got your text." I remembered the text like a small traitorous thing. I had hit send on a message meant for Raymond, a quick note, "I'm dizzy, please come," only to see Peter's name in the two-line. I had meant to call Raymond. My fingers betrayed me.
Or maybe I had wanted someone else to see. Patricia sat beside the bed, clutching a paper cup of hospital coffee so hard that her knuckles were white. She told me later, when our hands were warm and the room quiet, that she thought my door had been locked and Raymond wasn't returning her knocks. She had found the light in the kitchen on and the apartment silent. She called 911 because she didn't want to walk back out into the night and leave me there. Karen, the social worker, with soft eyes and a braid that swung like a pendulum when she walked, sat across from us and talked about next steps, medication, follow-up appointments, home care. She asked about my living situation, about who helped pay the bills. Each question felt like a small sieve, letting out something I had been holding in place for years. "Raymond handles things, right?" Karen asked gently. "Yes," I said, because it had been true for so long. After my husband died, Raymond said he'd take care of everything. He had signed forms, he had spoken to the bank. I believed him, because what else was there to do? I was 57 then, which felt both young and ancient in different rooms of my life. Now, in my hospital bed, I felt small and unmoored. Peter watched me while Karen filled out papers. He was quiet, but when he spoke, he did so like someone used to being listened to, with his hands on a keyboard, measured, precise. When he told Karen, "I'm a financial consultant," the soft little alarm bells that social workers have must have chimed. They write down the word and look for what it means. For me, the word meant invoices and bank phone calls, numbers that drift through the months like ghosts. For Peter, the word meant a career built out of untangling numbers people thought were theirs, but weren't. After I was discharged, with a little plastic bag of prescriptions and a promise to rest, it was Peter who packed my things into boxes. Raymond didn't come to the hospital. Raymond responded to my texts with, "I'll be right there," and then nothing. That pattern had existed like a low hum for years, promises that sounded like blankets but were thin and frayed. My apartment had always been small, the kind of place that collects sounds: the rain on the single-pane window, the hum of the radiator in winter, the drip stain on the kitchen ceiling that looked like a map you no longer recognized. I had learned to sleep with the blanket tucked under my chin because heat was expensive. My pills sat in a dented plastic tray with names that blurred together. What was for blood pressure? What was for sleep? What was to keep my heart steady? I counted out pills sometimes because I was afraid of running out. Raymond knew the list. He knew which ones to refill. I trusted him with that, the way I had once trusted any good child to tie loose knots tight.
Under the bed, where I kept things I couldn't throw away, old scarves, a pair of gloves missing the index finger, a shoebox with photographs inside, was a second shoebox. It was where I kept letters I had written and never sent. I had started writing to Peter years ago after Sharon's funeral. The shock of that winter still hissed in my ears sometimes. Sharon had been Peter's mother and my son's wife, gone 12 years now, a sudden absence that had left a silence like a missing tile in the floor. After she died, I kept writing to Peter because it was a way to speak without being heard, to send words into a drawer where they would not be turned into something else. I blamed myself for a long while. Grief told me to collect blame and wear it like a shawl. Peter found the shoebox when he came back to help me unpack. He sat cross-legged on the floor, and when he opened the lid, the air seemed to change. There were envelopes stacked like brittle leaves, dates penciled over, handwriting like whispering. He pulled one out and smiled the way someone smiles at an old book. "I never knew you wrote these," he said. I had never told anyone. For a long time, writing the letters was the one clean thing I could do for my grandson, putting the years into sentences that he might one day read. They were short notes at first, how school was going, how the garden had turned into stubborn weeds, but they grew into things that asked for forgiveness I hadn't earned and told stories I felt no right to speak aloud. Across the living room, the peeling wallpaper made a pale river. The teacup on the table had a hairline crack. The radio under the window was tuned to a station that talked about weather and nothing else. Peter sat for a long while, reading. I watched his fingers trace the edges of an envelope the way someone might trace a scar. "Why didn't you send them?" he asked at last. "I was ashamed," I said. "I thought I was protecting you from—" The word him came like a stone. I swallowed it. "Protecting you from Raymond, protecting you from the noise he brought into a room, protecting you from the awkwardness of grown men arguing about money, when what you needed was a mother to tuck you into bed and make the world make sense again." Peter's expression folded and refolded. He said nothing for a while, but his jaw flexed in that way it does when he is working through numbers in his head. That was his telling silence. He would investigate, he would count, he would make a paper trail become fact. When Peter asked to see my mail, I thought he was being careful. He wanted to know where the bills came, what cyclical things were happening with my accounts. Sometimes my pots and bills spoke the truth if you watched them long enough. I handed him the envelope stack I kept in the kitchen. They had been forwarded for years, then envelopes that arrived stamped in Raymond's handwriting. He took them to the table, sorted them like someone laying out bones. He found statements with my name and a different address. He found a letter from the bank that had a signature as if someone else had signed in my place. He found the words "power of attorney" written on a form. I did not know exactly what power of attorney meant when I signed those papers. Raymond had explained it once. "This way I can help you," he'd said. A half smile I trusted. He handled the calls. He said it would be easier if one person was the point. That was how he said it then, like a sentence stitched into place, impossible to pick at. Peter explained it to me slowly, in that translator tone he used with clients. Power of attorney is a legal document that lets someone act for you, pay bills, talk to a bank, make choices if you can't. It was a key. In my case, Raymond had held that key for years. He had used it, Peter said, but Peter's voice was steady when he used the word used. Used to focus the estate. Used to manage accounts. I could hear the soft pivot of understatement. That night, I couldn't sleep. The ceiling leak made a new drip, a slow percussion. The shoebox sat beside my bed like a little accused thing. Peter left to stay at an Airbnb down the street. He said it would be easier to work late without waking me at odd hours. He commuted back and forth like someone carrying a Secret Service badge in his pocket. Over the next few days, Peter called banks, quietly, the way you call someone who owes you clarity. He kept voice messages short. He visited the bank where my savings had been, the one I opened with Harold, I told him, because saying my husband's name made the room settle. Peter came back with photocopies and a pair of thick coffee cups. He spread papers across the table, statements, notations, a deed with my name crossed out, and another name printed over it, Raymond's. I don't remember how long I sat at the table. I put my palm to the paper as if to feel for a pulse. The numbers seemed to float above the page. There were withdrawals that didn't match the things I bought. No receipts for groceries or heating oil, but large sums flowing out to places I didn't recognize. There were credit card charges listed to a name I didn't know, and then small, regular transfers labeled support that were barely enough to cover what had been brought short somewhere along the line. How much? I asked, because that felt like the only real measure of the betrayal. Peter looked at me with the kind of sorry that doesn't have any emotion. These are the first pages, he said. But look, he tapped a line. The amount didn't make sense. The account balance looked starved. He told me the words in a voice that would be used to speaking to strangers about hard things. There are transfers to an unknown account. There are credit cards opened in your name and statements signed. Signed, Nana, as if someone else had been you. Signed. The word had a brittle edge.
I thought of my script of days, the pattern of trusting that Raymond would take care of things. I had been careful with food. I had been slow at heating. I had held my phone because I didn't want the sound of asking to become a constant. I saw now, small and bright, that my omissions were a kind of vulnerability Raymond had learned to profit from. I looked at Peter then, really looked, and saw the reflection of years in him. He had been a small boy the day Sharon was taken. He had become the man who would not let that history pass in silence. "Why didn't you tell me, Nana?" he asked softly, and this time the why didn't demand explanation. It asked for the truth of my interior life. "I didn't want to cause trouble," I said. "I thought if I didn't look, maybe it wasn't happening. I thought if I kept the letters and didn't bother him, it would be easier." It was a terrible kind of logic, self-protective and small. I had convinced myself that not knowing was a form of peace. Peace, it turns out, is expensive. Peter made a list. He is a man who makes lists the way some people pray. He wrote down banks, dates, names. He wrote down the things he could call and the things he couldn't. He said the bank would ask for identification. He said the bank would say they needed a report. He said the first step was to get a full ledger, all the statements from the time the power of attorney was signed. "Then we'll know," he said, and there was a hard clench in his voice I hadn't heard from him before. I called Raymond once that week. I asked if he had come to the hospital because I couldn't understand why he hadn't. He said he was sorry he wasn't there. Traffic. He said he would come by that afternoon. He didn't come. He texted later. "Talk soon." He left it at that. How many apologies can breathe before they become empty air? The question hummed in me. Patricia came by with a Tupperware of stew and an unwillingness to ask questions. She sat at my table and listened to Peter explain, in small pieces, the architecture of the theft. He used her plain words when she asked. He had power of attorney. He signed. He moved the house. He took the checks. I watched Patricia fold and refold her hands. The neighbor, who kept the spare key and always had a biscuit ready, looked at me like someone trying to see into a closed room. On the third night after I came home, Peter piled the paper into 2 neat stacks and held out what he called the initial findings. He had brought them in a file folder with a fastener that clicked under his thumb. The folder had copies of statements, bank stamps, a single line that said deed transferred in a handwriting that was son's business casual. He explained one document to me, a life insurance policy that had been paid out after Harold died, not the amount, just the fact that the payout had been assigned in a way I didn't recognize. He told me, in that careful voice he reserves for people who cannot be broken by the truth, that there were entries looking like monthly withdrawals that didn't match my life. "If these are the numbers," he said, "they add up to a pattern that looks like taking, Nana." Taking. The word landed like a plate. For years I had told myself I was being prudent, letting Raymond handle money because he lived closer, because he had a steady job,
because he swore it would be easier. I had believed him. That belief didn't make me foolish. It made me human, desperate to be spared the mechanics of money that look like armor to younger, busier people. Peter folded his hands and looked at me, as if I were both a client and a person. "We start slow," he said. "We get the records. We make copies. We talk to a lawyer if it looks like we need to." He said lawyer with a measured weight, not like a hammer, but like a tool that could help. I nodded, because that was all I could do. That night I slept with a shoebox under my arm. The letters had a smell of paper and old perfume. I read one again, a short one from the year after Sharon's funeral, where I wrote about the garden and asked how Peter was sleeping. I remember tucking it back and telling myself that not sending it was kinder, that it preserved him from the complications of grown men's money. I had been protecting him the best way I knew how, by silence. In the morning, Peter came back with a man in a suit and a briefcase. He introduced him as a friend, a forensic accountant who did this sort of work. I had seen men like that in television dramas, hovering over spreadsheets and sipping terrible coffee. This man, thin, with glasses that caught the light, set up a matrix on the dining table and began to talk in a language that felt half mathematical and half moral. He said words like paper trail and forged signatures and diverted funds. When he used forged, I felt a coldness spread out from my ribs like a dark wash. Peter put his hand over mine. "We don't know yet," he said, "but we have to look." He worked quietly, using spreadsheets and phone calls. He called banks and asked for ledgers and account histories. He tracked down the deed on my house. It had a transfer recorded with a date and a signature that looked like mine but was off, as if someone had done it with an unsteady hand trying to mimic me. He found, or rather the record showed, a line item that said transfer to Raymond and a notation about Social Security payments being rerouted. As he talked, he would stop and explain. He said Social Security is a mailed benefit people rely on. Its diversion is when someone arranges for those checks to go somewhere else. When he said credit cards opened in your name, I thought of the small plastic card I had once been given and lost in the drawer. I never would have imagined someone could make a card be my name and not my life. When the forensic accountant said the numbers out loud, they hovered between me and the ceiling like fireflies. At first, they were just digits, figures that felt unrelated to the meals I ate and the shoes I owned. But as he spoke, each sum became a scene, a ticket sold, a dinner that never happened in my kitchen, a chip on a gambling floor. The things that held a life together were being counted away. They came in pieces like this, gradual and relentless. A monthly transfer here, a little withdrawal there, a credit line that had been increased beyond what I would ever need. Each item on a list that for years had been hidden in plain sight. I remembered the little things that had seemed odd in the past. The time my heating went unpaid, despite Raymond saying he'd taken care of it. The time a notice came about an insurance premium I'd supposedly missed, only to find that the premium had been redirected and then canceled. The occasionally suspicious calls asking if I wanted to consolidate debt. I had shrugged each of these off in different ways. Forgetfulness, a bank error, the kind of administrative noise that always surrounds money. When Peter set the papers down and showed me line after line, the pattern felt impossible to ignore. He slid a photocopy across the table. The inked signature looked like mine, but the context made it feel like a stranger's handwriting on my life. "Do you remember signing this?" he asked. I stared. I remembered sitting at a small table with Raymond, the papers in neat stacks, his hand closing the moment mine trembled. I remembered the bland office, the way he explained that this was simpler, the way he promised to keep things tidy. I had trusted him. To believe otherwise now felt like accusing the whole of my past decisions. "Maybe I signed," I said. Maybe I didn't know what I was signing. The line between consent and deception thinned into something sharp. Peter nodded. "That's what we'll find out," he said. "We'll compare handwriting, we'll get the bank records, the title history. If there's a power of attorney on file with your signature, we'll see when it was signed and how it was used." When he put the first bank statement in front of me, the room seemed to sway. The numbers filled the page. Withdrawals, transfers, payments. Some were small, gas, fast food, but others were large and unexpected. Some sent to accounts labeled with names I had never heard. Peter's finger found a line and held it as if offering me a hand. "Look," he said. When I looked, I couldn't find anything else in the room. The floor, the table, the ceiling blurred and shrank to the thickness of the paper. The account balance had been drained in a way that made the bones of a life feel thin. The room felt like it was tilting. When Peter slid that photocopy across the table, the room narrowed to the size of the paper. The signature looked like mine by shape, but something about the pressure and the curl of the letters was wrong.
like someone trying to remember how I held a pen and getting the memory a little off. I pressed my thumb to the ink, as if touching it could tell me whether it belonged to my hand. After that moment, the days blurred into work and waiting. Peter set a rhythm I could follow. Early calls, quiet visits, paper spread across the kitchen table under the pale lamp that had survived 3 winters. He would fetch coffee. I would make the toast I could still manage. He began to talk like someone building scaffolding around a collapsed wall, small beams of certainty in the face of a wide, uncertain hole. He brought in the forensic accountant, the man with the glasses who could make spreadsheets read like testimony. The accountant explained things in plain, patient sentences. A power of attorney lets someone act on your behalf, he said. It can be fine. It's often a kindness. In some cases, it means a person has legal access to accounts and can sign documents for you. But when that access is used to move money for the agent's benefit, that's a misuse. We follow the ledger. We look for patterns. Pattern was the word Peter and the accountant returned to again and again. Pattern is what turns a handful of odd transactions into something unmistakable. They found transfers labeled support that arrived irregularly. Small deposits here, large withdrawals there. They found a deed transfer recorded for a sale of the house for $320,000, a number that slid across the page like a cold foreign coin. They found a life insurance payout noted in a letter from an insurer, an amount that read like possibility turned into paper, $150,000. They found Social Security payments that had been redirected to an account that did not belong to me. Each document was a little violation, the sort you could miss if you were trying to keep your life together, if you were counting out pills or wrapping tea bags in a half-used towel to make them last. Each document, when stacked together, showed something else, a long, careful taking. The forensic accountant spoke slowly about signatures and handwriting analysis. We can't say conclusively from one photocopy, he told us, but the way the ink sits and the pressure used can be compared to known signatures. If there's a mismatch and the bank accepted it, that's evidence we can use. The banks will have their own records too, copies of original signatures, identification provided when accounts were opened. We'll ask for all those. He said we, like he had already put his hand on the problem. Peter opened an account with me at the small bank where my savings had been. He sat across from the teller and kept the conversation steady as if he were reading a script he'd written for other frightened people. I signed what they asked me to sign, because after all that paper, there were still things I needed to do, like phone calls I couldn't make myself, and a new card in my name that belonged to me again. We went to see a lawyer. She was younger than I expected, but her voice was the sort you could fold in on when things felt like they might float away. She listened to everything, in the way a person listens when they know details will become steps. We'll start with civil avenues, and we will open a criminal complaint, she said. She explained the difference without judgment, like laying out a map. Civil action would seek restitution, money returned, the undoing of transfers where possible, perhaps the reversal of a deed if the court found it had been procured improperly. Criminal action would mean the state would investigate whether the acts constituted elder financial abuse or fraud, which could result in charges and sentencing. She warned me that the legal path was not a tidy ladder. It was a long road that required patience and evidence. Is it common? I asked, my voice small. It's not unusual, she said, but every case is its own thing. We have to build the evidence, the bank records, the signatures, the transaction histories. We'll need to show intent, timing, that the act was not authorized or was beyond the authority given. She looked at me then, and in the curve of her expression was something like permission. You can be angry and afraid. You can do both. Peter and the accountant took on the lead of the discovery work. Nights they sat in the rented room and unfolded statements like maps. Peter called creditors and knocked on doors. He subpoenaed records. He compared dates, when the power of attorney had been signed to when large withdrawals began. There were months where my account sagged low, and then an immediate spurt of cash out the same week. There were months when a payment I had asked Raymond to make, heating oil, my phone, did not come, and instead the money disappeared elsewhere. One evening, after a day of calls, Peter handed me a printout with columns. He had written at the top in his handwriting that looked steady and decisive, Initial Ledger, 2008-2000 present. He looked at me with a gaze that knew both what I had lost and what we might reclaim. The total trace so far is, he began, and when he said the number, it was a strange, heavy thing, $487,000. Saying it made me feel as if the air had weight. It matches the picture, the accountant said. There are transfers to accounts associated with Raymond. There are purchases that don't align with your lifestyle. There are signs of accounts opened in your name. There are questionable signatures. It's a pattern consistent with financial exploitation. When people say exploitation, you imagine a tall concept, an abstract wrong. To us, it was the freezer not working, the unpaid premium, the months of rationed pills. It was also a series of transactions, $2,000 here, $6,500 there, a chunk that paid for something like a vacation or a new car. Money has many ways of changing shape once it leaves your hands. Raymond heard about the investigation the way people hear about storms on the radio, an alarm distant at first, then loud. We arranged to meet in a neutral place, a small diner with chipped counter and cheap coffee, the kind where the booths are vinyl and the waitress knows everyone's name. It felt safer to have other people around, ordinary hum between the lines. He arrived with the same neatness he'd always had. He sat down and folded his hands. His mouth made apologies in the way practiced people do, almost ready but not quite over the threshold. He said he'd help, that he had been trying to take care of things, that numbers were confusing, and that he had spent in ways he thought would help me. He used words like support and maintenance and keeping up the bills, as if they were shields. Peter placed the folder on the table and opened it. "These are not small errors," he said. "These are transfers and deposits that go to your accounts. These are credit cards in her name used for purchases you paid for." Raymond's eyes flicked between me and the papers. He said slowly, "I did what I thought was best. The house needed repairs. There were medical bills. I took money to keep things afloat." "Did you ask her?" Peter asked. Raymond looked at his hands. "She trusted me. She always trusted me. I thought," he swallowed, "I thought I'd put it back." The idea that theft could be justified by an intention to restore is both an old human story and a terrible one. It does not make the taking less real to the one taken from. The words made me nervous and paradoxically more anchored. They were tools. At one point, a mediation was proposed. Raymond's lawyer reached out with a plan: restitution in installments, community service, probation, terms that might avoid a protracted trial. We were told that a plea could present an opportunity for quicker financial recovery, a resolution that, while not perfect, would remove Raymond's control and create a permanent record of wrongdoing. The judge's sanction, the lawyer said, would send a message. Coming into that courtroom felt like stepping into a pulsing place of validation. The room smelled faintly of old wood and cleaning fluid. Sunlight cut through high windows. People shuffled papers. The judge, an older woman with a steady voice, listened while the prosecutor laid out the case in measured language. The story was now in legal form: unauthorized transfers, forged signatures, diversion of benefits. The plea agreement was read aloud in short official sentences: restitution to be paid, probation terms, community service, and a recognition of guilt entered by the defendant. When the judge said, plainly, "This court finds that the evidence supports a plea of guilty to charges of elder financial exploitation," I felt something in my chest unbolt. It was not jubilation so much as a settling, like a breath that had been held for too long finally released. The judge's words provided a formal acknowledgement of what had felt true for a long time, that the pattern was deliberate and damaging. There were other sounds: Raymond's whispering conversation with his attorney, the low murmur of people in the courtroom. But for that moment, my thoughts were simple and close. The heating bill that finally got paid, the pills I could stop counting in my head, the ability to keep the groceries on an even rhythm. The restitution figure they spoke of, $487,000, was the number of how the year's worth of small deprivations and large misdirections added up. It was not a number that could put all the stolen time back, but it could open doors closed by poverty and control. After the judge finished, I was called to provide a victim impact statement. I had never imagined standing in front of a courtroom to say the things you would have thought too private to speak aloud. I spoke simply, in a voice that shook sometimes, about the nights I worried, and the times I refused to call because I worried I would be a bother. I spoke about Sharon and the silence that followed her death, and how that silence had been filled with excuses rather than care. I did not call my son a villain. I said what his actions had done to my life. The words felt both terrible and necessary. The sentence was a mix of things I had been told to expect: restitution ordered, probation assigned, community service required, and a criminal record that would make it difficult for Raymond to claim those kinds of powers again.
He would have to pay back money under court supervision. That payment schedule would be written into the record. It was not total restoration. There is no legal mechanism for undoing all the years, but it was public accountability. In this case, the law moved as far as it could. What happened to Raymond afterward is complicated in ways that words flatten. He made some payments, failed sometimes on others, and there were hearings about compliance. There were moments I felt anger so pure I could taste it. There were moments I felt something like grief for a son who had chosen a path I could not follow him on. The truth of it is a bittersweet thing. Justice does not always equal reconciliation. The paperwork and the court dates made me feel tired in a new, different way. There were days when the practicalities of life, appliance repair, doctor appointments, the most ordinary errands, stood up and reminded me that life continued while we sorted out the past. But slowly, with the restitution and the legal protections in place, a small, steady rebuilding began. I moved, finally, into a modest house not far from the neighborhood I had left. It had a small patch of yard with soil that held the shape of footsteps like an old map. I painted a corner of the kitchen bright yellow and put a kettle on a real stove that didn't complain when I turned it high. For the first time in years, I did not have to choose between turning on the heat or eating well. That was a small miracle that was almost ridiculous in its simplicity, but one that felt enormous to me. I planted a tomato plant the first spring. Peter came over with his gloves and a trowel. He showed me how to hold the plant to give it room to root. My hands remembered in a way memory had not. I dug into the dirt like I was uncovering an older truth. The world takes what you give it and returns something rooted. Gardening became my therapy. The soil was honest. If you tended it, it would give back in green. If you neglected it, things withered. There were other restorations, less dramatic but no less important. My prescriptions were filled without me counting out pills. I started going to a small community center for a weekly group where people of my age came to knit and talk. We traded recipes and grumbled together about the rising price of almost everything. Patricia came by with food and with a presence that felt like a light that doesn't demand anything but is happy to be seen. She read me the news sometimes, and we laughed at the absurdness of the world. The ordinary interactions, the mundane kindnesses, mail that arrived addressed just to me, a phone that rang with a friend instead of a bill collector, felt like stitches. My relationship with Peter grew into something different from the one I had with my son. Our conversations were not haunted by the old silences. They had a workman's tone, practical, unromantic, and honest. He came for dinners, sometimes with overnight bags stashed in the trunk because he liked staying late and talking about nothing. We formed our own small rituals. We had a Tuesday night where we would try a new recipe and argue in a friendly way about whether garlic belonged in every dish. He brought his friends sometimes and defended my cooking in a way that made me laugh. There was grief to live with. Grief for what had happened and for the son I had once thought I knew. I tried not to shrink from that complexity. I mourned possibilities that would not be realized. The man Raymond might have been if he'd chosen differently, the relationship we would not have. But grief softened into something quieter that could coexist with gratitude for the things repaired, for the house with a stove, for hands in the earth, for a grandson who had not run from the mess. The community did something I had not expected. They rallied. Once the court proceedings were public, people came forward. Neighbors, a former coworker of Raymond's who said she'd been surprised at his sudden purchases, an old friend who testified that they had seen him with money he could not explain. Small acts of bearing witness mattered in ways I hadn't known. Patricia brought over a cake for a birthday where the candles were small but real. The neighbors sang like church bells. Healing, I learned, is not a single event, but a series of necessary retellings. I told the story to doctors and to friends. I told it in the courtroom and at the community center, where someone asked me to speak about elder exploitation. For a while, speaking about it felt like picking a scab, painful and necessary. Eventually, the telling became a way of warning others softly, not with alarm, but with information. Keep records. Know who handles your accounts. Keep a shoebox of letters because they are proof of a life. There were many practical lessons I learned and tried to keep close without turning them into prescriptions. Peter helped me set up direct deposit for my benefits, so they arrived in my name and at a bank where I could call and speak to someone with identification protocols. A local social worker sat with me and explained the protections available to seniors and the red flags to watch for. I did not become obsessive, but I was careful. Care is different after you've been taken from. Forgiveness. People ask about forgiveness as if it is a single, tidy thing you check off a list. For me, forgiveness came in pieces. I could no longer trust Raymond with money, nor could I summon the relationship we had before. I found a reluctant compassion that allowed me to see him in court and to accept that his life would be judged by the choices he'd made. I told him in no uncertain terms that his actions had consequences and that he had to live with those consequences. I could also, later, wish him well from a distance in a way that was honest and not performative.
Peter's role in my life became a kind of living bridge. He was both family by blood and chosen family by action. He refused to let the past be erased by silence. He taught me the language of ledgers and the softer language of patience. He would sometimes read me the old letters from the shoebox, the ones I had written and never sent, and we would both laugh at my older self's dramatic metaphors and cry at the moments that still carried weight. "You were always so careful with words," he told me once, and I smiled like a woman who had finally been heard. On the anniversary of the day I collapsed, we had a small celebration. There was a cake with a single candle, more a symbol than anything. Patricia brought the stew she'd always made. We sang the way neighbors do, off-key and sincere. I felt lighter in a way I hadn't in years, not because the past was gone, but because the present had taken on a gentleness I hadn't allowed myself before. People sometimes ask me whether the court's decision fixed me. No legal outcome can unpick the emotional threads entirely, but the court acknowledged what I had suspected for years. That acknowledgement mattered. The restitution put money back where it belonged. The probation and the public record took away the ability to quietly siphon a life again. For me, validation and a return of some financial stability were the two pillars of a slow rebuilding. I still have nights where memories press against the window, and I wake to think of what might have been. I allow those nights without letting them define how I move in the day. I cook the meals I want to cook. I keep the kettle on the stove and a stack of small notes folded in the top drawer, the kinds of letters the shoebox used to hold, but now some of them I send. I write now with a different purpose: to reach, to remember, to laugh, to insist someone answer back. Sometimes I stand in the garden and think about the shoebox under my bed, the brittle envelopes stacked like leaves, and I feel gratitude for the small gesture that saved me from continuing that solitude. Those unsent words fell into Peter's hands and became evidence and ultimately a way out. It is a strange kind of mercy when your quiet becomes someone else's action. If there is a single thing I hope to leave with you, it's this: dignity is not a static thing you either have or lose. It can be reclaimed in slow, practical steps, through paperwork, through witnesses, through courtrooms, through new banks and new friendships. It can be reclaimed in tomato plants and in Tuesday dinners. It can be reclaimed in small domestic acts that say, "I belong to my life." As for Raymond, our relationship is what it is, a complex knot I have decided not to untie in the old way. There is no dramatic reconciliation, no neat finale. There is accountability, public and private. There is a space he cannot step back into. Whether he will ever find his way to repair that space is not a question I can answer for anyone but myself. I tell this story because I want others to know that asking for help is not shameful, that a shoebox of letters can be proof, and that a grandson who chooses to show up can change the course of a life. I also tell it so that people who are worried, those who sit in their kitchens counting pills and wondering whether to trust, might find a way to reach out, to find a neighbor like Patricia, a lawyer like ours, or a community that will listen. Should a son get a second chance? That's a question I wrestle with often. It's easy to answer in the abstract. It's far harder in the life you actually live. For me, there has been cautious distance, boundaries that by law and by choice prevent a repeat. I have learned to protect myself and to give love in ways that do not expose me to harm. If this story touches you, I hope you'll share it with someone who needs to hear that small things, the letters in a box, a neighbor who notices lights left on, a grandson who doesn't look away, can matter enormously. If you want to tell me where you're watching from, or if you've been through anything like this, leave a comment. And if you found a measure of solace here, consider subscribing for more stories of survival and rebuilding. My life after that kitchen floor is quieter than it once was, but in the best possible way. There is space now for new routines, for gardening, for real sleep that does not come with a tally of what I could not pay. There is a table where friends come with dishes and hands that reach out without taking. There is a grandson who sits across from me and gets the jokes I used to think only I would understand. The house I live in is small, but it holds the sound of real laughter
and the smell of cooking that isn't measured by necessity. The stove hums in a loyal way. The tomatoes in the summer get sun and grow fat. The shoebox remains, but now it is a relic of the life that was and a reminder of the life I still have the right to live fully. When I think about that night on the kitchen floor, about the breath that wouldn't come and the wrong name that saved me, I am still astonished that such a small misstep could lead to such a vast unraveling and to a new kind of repair. It's a strange, honest thing to survive what you thought would finish you. It's stranger still to discover that survival can become a bridge to others. Thank you for listening. If this story raised questions or memories for you, please share them in the comments. If you'd like to see more stories like this, of justice, of quiet healing, of people who show up, subscribe and share with someone who needs a reminder that restoration, while difficult, is possible.